Hi there, I'm Victoria Peat and welcome along to this demonstration video where I'm going to show you how to sew the letter O from my mini foundation paper piece to alphabet. The pattern's available to download from the website. You get all of the letters of the alphabet in uppercase plus 7 special characters. Each of the letters are 1.5 inches wide and 2 inches tall, so they're pretty small. Let's have a look at how we make it. So here we have the pattern page for the letter O. I've ranked it as 3-star, but maybe I'm being a little bit harsh. There are some small pieces and you will certainly need your add an 1/8 ruler, but it's probably somewhere between a 2 and a 3-star. You've got your layout diagram as with all the other letters. You've got a colouring in version and one that talks to you about the assembly. It's only one block, so that from that perspective, that's why it sort of goes down into a 2-star rather than a 3. You've got your pattern piece here. Always double check your 1-inch test square to make sure that you've printed out your pattern page correctly. But that's your pattern page. Right, let's have a look. I've got the pattern piece here and I have trimmed it to just to the outside of the dotted line on the outside edge. Just get that to focus. I'm sure you can see. I've not trimmed on that dotted line. I've just trimmed to the outside of that line. I've got a cutting mat. I'll be using a small cutting mat today. I'll have 2 rulers. I've got my standard acrylic ruler and I have an add an 1/8 ruler. I've got my fabrics. I've got a glue pen, a fabric glue pen, and I've got 2 rotary cutters. I've got one for cutting my fabrics and one for trimming up at the end. I've also got my pressing surface. I've got a wool pressing mat. I've got my mini iron and I have my wooden clapper. So that's, I think, everything I need. So I'm going to get started. To begin with, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold along each of these solid lines on my pattern piece. I've printed out on standard printer paper, which is about 80 GSM. So it's a little bit thicker when you're doing foundation paper piecing. So I always find it's easier, particularly when we're working on a smaller scale, just to pre-fold all of these lines. It just makes life for me, I think, a little bit easier. So I'm just folding on all of those. Be as accurate as you can be, but don't panic if you've gone a little bit off the line. It's there just to give you a helping hand as you're going through the process. As you can see, I've got the pattern lying face down, and I'm just folding back on each of those lines as I go around the pattern. So each of the solid lines, I haven't done the outside edge dotted lines, we won't need those. And I think that's all of them. Just have a little look. Yeah, that looks like I've got all of them. Right, the pattern piece has been shaded for you so that it kind of, it's particularly when some of these are smaller, it's hard to tell what's what. But the shaded ones, the ones with the dots on, are the parts of the letter that are the actual letter rather than the background. I am making all of these letters out of a pink fabric with a blue background. We're going to sew in order as we do always. So I'm going to start off with placing a little bit of glue on the back of section 1, just a bit in the middle. It's been warm, so my glue pen's a little bit different to normal. It's normally a bit more solid than that. So I've got that on the reverse of section number 1. I'm then going to take a small piece of fabric, because number 1 is background. And I'm just going to start off with this rectangular piece here. You need a piece of fabric that's going to be big enough for the section that you're looking at, so piece number 1. Plus, I'm using an add an 1/8 of a ruler, but if you're adding an add a 1/4 ruler, then you need to bear that in mind. But I need a piece of fabric big enough for piece number 1, plus 1/8 of an inch all of the way around. So I'm just placing this centrally on that piece of fabric that I've cut. And I'm making sure it's big enough. If you're not sure, you can use a light box or you can hold this up to the light to shine a light through your pattern to see whether that's going to be big enough. I'm quite happy with that. So I'm going to fold back on line for number 2 and I'm going to trim away some of this excess. I'm going to take my add an 1/8 ruler, lie that up against the fold in my fabric and I'm going to trim off that excess. So now our seam allowance is ready to add on to the next piece of fabric. Piece number two, or piece number two is the pink that I'm using. So I'm going to place that up against a straight edge. You need a piece of fabric that's going to be big enough for two, plus, because I'm using an 1/8 ruler, 1/8 of an inch all the way around. So I can see from this side, you may not be able to see on the camera, that the piece that I am looking at is only, it's only this big. So that's piece number two, and then I will just roughly, a bit generous, so I will show you on there. So I've shaded in piece number two on the reverse, and then I've roughly drawn where that 1/8 of an inch seam allowance is. So I need to make sure that my piece of fabric on the underside is going to be big enough to sit underneath that section. You can see here I'm working with a bigger piece of fabric. Now you can cut a tiny little rectangle and sit it underneath, but I find that when you come to take it across to your sewing machine, it's more difficult to pick up, whereas if I've got this larger piece, there's more to it, and you kind of see where it is, and you'll notice when you get lost. So I'm now going to sew this. I'm making sure when I'm across at the sewing machine that these raw edges are still lined up against each other, and I'm going to flip the paper across, and I'm going to slide underneath my presser foot. As I do so, what I'm checking for is just to make sure that this fabric here hasn't accidentally folded under on itself when I'm going underneath the presser foot. So I'm feeling and looking just to make sure that that doesn't get caught. What I'm doing is I'm going to be stitching on the line. Foundation paper piecing is all about stitching on the line. So I'm going to place my needle in. I'm going to start a couple of stitches before the line starts. I have my machine set up with a 1.2 stitch length. This will make it easier for removing the papers later. So I've done a couple stitches, I've stitched on the line, and then I'm doing a couple stitches beyond. So I'll show you that here. We've done a couple stitches before the start of the line, on the line, and then a couple of stitches beyond. So I'm now going to take that and press. So I'm going to press it to get it warm. I'm going to make sure my iron's at the correct temperature. I'm going to press that flat. That will warm up your fibres and make it easier to manipulate the fabric. When that's warm, I'm bringing the fabric over, across the line where I've done my stitching. It's only a small section, so you have to be quite gentle. Don't pull your fabric, your top fabric that you're folding back, don't pull it too hard, because you don't want to expose the stitching that you've done. Just make sure that it's totally perpendicular if you're not pulled too much to the left or to the right. And allow that to cool. I'm then going to take off some of this excess. I'm not going to be too precious about this one. I'm just going to go on the outside edge of the block. And then I'm going to go and have a look at piece number 3. So at the moment we've got piece number 1 in the middle, piece number 2 that's going to be a tiny piece at the top here. I'm then going to come and do piece number 3 at the bottom. So I'm going to fold back on line number 3. And now I'm going to get rid of this excess at the other end of piece number 1. Place my 1/8 ruler against the fold on the paper, trim off that excess, and then we're going to do exactly the same as we did for piece number 2, and we're going to do that with piece number 3. I'm going to place that. The piece that I'm stitching, again, is only very small. It's this section here plus the seam allowance, just that little bit there. So I'm going to place this part here quite close up to this left hand edge of this piece of fabric, and I'm going to place this raw edge here across this top. And I'm going to sew that in place. Raw edges nice and straight, flip the paper over, position the needle couple stitches before the line starts, stitch a couple stitches on the line, and then off the other end a couple of stitches. So again, a bit difficult to see in the white, but we're doing a couple stitches to the left of the line or before the line starts, along the line, and a couple stitches the other end. And go flat, pull that fabric over, gently just making sure I'm not pulling too far to the left or the right. And allow that to cool. The more you can allow that to cool, the sharper those seams are going to be. Okay, so we've done 1, 2, and 3. We need to come along and do piece number 4 on the side, which is again a piece of pink. So I'm just going to again roughly take away that excess. So on the reverse, or the right side even, you've got piece 1, 2, and 3. Piece number 4 goes along the side. It's the side section of the O. We're going to fold back along line number 4, but if you remember, we're starting stitching just a couple of stitches before the line, which means that when you fold back along this line, you just need to release some of those stitches from the paper. Just try and hold with your fingernail or the tip of your finger, just to try not to pull on those stitches too much, because you don't want them to come loose. It's okay if you tear a couple of holes in the paper. So fold back along that line, take your add an 1/8 ruler and trim away that excess. We now have a nice straight edge for sewing on piece number 4. Piece number 4 is quite long. It's almost the same length as the entire block. So I'm not going to get it out of that, or am I? Oh yes, I'm going to get it out of here. So I'm going to chop off this piece here. So I have a nice long straight edge. I can then position that in the middle. Pick all of those up. Oh, actually, there's a little nick in that fabric. Just going to take a little bit off because I'm working with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I've got a little nick from when I've cut in this direction, when I've trimmed up something else. So I just don't want to add that little nick or that split into my block. I'll place that on the straight edge, and we'll repeat the process. Couple stitches at the start, then along the line, all the way down the line, and a couple stitches beyond. And we'll press again. It's slightly easier to pull this one back because it's a little bit longer. And we'll allow that to cool. Okay, and we'll trim that off. So piece number 5, so we've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. 5, 6, 7, and 8 are background, well, the rest on this side are going to be background fabric, and it's just creating the curve at the top or the edges of the O. So I'm going to fold back for piece number 5. We're going to trim off the pink to give us a neat seam allowance to start off with. And it's just a tiny little triangle. I'm going to place that. I can visually see from this side, when I flip it back, I can see that the triangle kind of starts and finishes there. So I'm going to place that on the middle of this straight section here, because I know it's only a little triangle plus the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, so that will be plenty big enough. I'm going to pick that up, flip it over, insert the needle, just double checking that things haven't slid out the way underneath. Presser foot down with the line in the middle of the presser foot. and stitch as we have done before. Just pulling carefully. I'm using white thread today, so I don't want that showing on my letter. Roughly cut that off. So now we're going to move on to piece number 6, which is another small triangle going a slightly different angle. Just going to fold that back and trim off this excess here. Right, the line here and the fold here is quite long, but the little triangle that we're doing is actually just a very little one. Hoping that will focus. It's just this little one here. So it looks very small, but when you fold it back, it looks like it's a really large triangle, but you don't need a piece of fabric that big. But I am working from larger pieces of fabric. But just when you're placing, you can place this, for example, on this one here, you can place a little bit further to the right than you would do if you were looking at the larger piece. If I was trying to cover this entire triangle, I wouldn't be placing quite so far to this side, but because I know I'm only just doing this tiny little bit here plus my seam allowances, I can scooch across a little bit further. Needle down and sewing along the line. And then once that's warmed, you pull back along the line of stitching and cool it. So that's that top corner done. So I'll show you there. These ones are just creating the roundness on this corner. We're going to go down and do this opposite corner here. So we've got piece number 7. And if you lose track, you can always count what number you're up to, because when it's small, you can very easily lose track. So just count, doesn't matter which order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we've got 6 pieces of fabric. Therefore, we're looking for number 7. It's worth just doing that every now and then to make sure that you're keeping up to date, because there's nothing worse than getting to an end of a block and realizing that you've left out one tiny piece, but that tiny piece could make all the difference to the shape of the design. It's so frustrating. Okay, so a little triangle. I'll pop that just on that edge there. It's gone a bit skewy, so I'm just going to reposition that so it's straight. Flip the paper over. So whilst these are tiny pieces, I hope you can see how, even though they're tiny, we're using exactly the same techniques as you would do normally for foundation paper piecing. Nothing changes. Maybe the size of the fabric has changed, but you can see that I'm working with slightly larger pieces of fabric anyway to stop it being quite so fiddly. I'm taking that off, and then I'm folding back on the line to add piece number 8. Get rid of this excess from the pieces that we've already sewn. And let's see, just going to straighten up this. I can pick up my ruler. See, I've got here another one where I've I've cut into the fabric and just gone over a little bit. I'm just getting rid of that so I don't incorporate that into my block. Got myself a straight edge. They're all still nicely lined up. A couple stitches beyond. Warm it up. There we go, let's trim off that excess. So we've done pieces 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we have 8 pieces. The next piece we're going to sew is piece number 9, which is down the side of the block. We'll fold back along that line, just tearing the paper a little bit to release those stitches, and then we'll trim to get rid of this excess, because you really don't want the excess in your block. It makes it really bulky and impossible to work with, and just your work won't lie very flat at the end. Okay, so piece number 9, we need a larger piece. Probably not quite this large, but we'll work with it. So piece number 9, nearly the width of the block or the height of the block. Place that against that straight edge. Doesn't look very straight. Let's reposition that. Put the needle down, presser foot down when I'm happy that that line is in the middle of the presser foot. It's looking good. Trim this off. I'm going just to the outside of my pattern piece. So now we have got half of the letter O. So you've got the middle, the tops and the side. We've curved around the edges and we've finished off this one side. So now we can come back across to the other side. We're going to do piece number 10, which is the other half of the O in pink. Get rid of all of that excess. Lovely straight edge. Find the right spot for the needle, couple stitches length away from the start of the line. So along the line with that shorter stitch length, and then a couple of stitches beyond. Okay, let's trim this off. Right, now piece number 11, 12, 13 and 14. These are like these other ones that we've done, these small triangles. So let's start off with piece 11. Just folding back along that line, and because I've pre-folded those before I started, they fold back nice and easily. If you haven't pre-folded, what you can do is, if your ruler has got like a chamfer on one end. You can place that against the line and fold back, or you can use a postcard or something like that. All right, this is just a little triangle. Let's see, I think I can get that out of this section. Always worth keeping your scraps if you're doing foundation paper piecing, because you just never know when you've got a tiny little spot that needs a bit of fabric and you've got just the right size. Foundation paper piecing is a great skill to have if you have got a sizable stash, because it's a great way of using up bits and pieces. You see, sometimes I'm using the edge of my iron and other times I'm using my fingers to move that fabric across. I find that when I'm working with smaller pieces, it's easier to use my hands rather than to use either the tip or the side of the iron. Piece number 12. Folding back, trimming off that excess. So piece number 12, that might actually go in there. Let's iron it and see. I think we might be able to get it out of that little straight line there. So I'm just looking for where the start of the line is and just placing my fingernail, the start and end. And because we're only working, or I'm working with an add an eighth ruler, I know that I'm not going to need too much fabric either side to allow for the seam allowance, because an eighth of an inch is jolly small. Needle down, and sew on the line. And it's important to try and remember to sew on the line, because they're your design lines, that's what's creating your shape. So try and keep to those as accurately as you can, and you'll get the best results possible. Okay, let's get rid of some of this on the outside. So you can see we're starting to now create the curve on the other side. We're now going to come down and do these two at the bottom edge, 13 and 14. So I'm folding back, add an eighth, butt that up against the folded line, trim off that excess. We're now going to sew in piece number 13. Place that, or you go on at the top. Got that on a straight edge. So what are you thinking? Have I been unfair by calling this a 3-star? I think I maybe have been. They are smaller pieces, but it's one section, so there's no joining of sections to do. Trim off, fold back for 14. That sounds like a slogan for something. Fold back for 14. All right, trim off that excess. And it's just a little one. Pop that on that straight edge that we've just cut. Just want to line up these raw edges so I'm not unnecessarily adding extra bulk. And we're on the line. I'm going to do this one with my hands. Just try and get the angle right. Oh, it's really coming together now. Good grief, I've moved that without letting it cool. Let's chop this off. Okay, so you can see there, it's looking good. We're now going to sew the piece that mirror images this one to come chop off the edge. Get rid of all of that excess. And we want a lovely edge. To get piece number 15. Goes most of the length of the block. And just a couple of stitches beyond. Looking good. So that's nearly done. We've just got 2 more bits to go. There we go, looking good. We just now need to take off the top and the bottom. So we do 16. Fold back along the line, just carefully tearing the paper to release the stitches. Use your ruler to trim off that excess. Position, we'll need a piece of fabric that's longer than your pattern piece. And this time we're going to be sewing not only on the line, but we're going to be sewing through the seam allowance at each end. And I'll show you that once we've stitched. Carefully, carefully on the line. And we've gone through the seam allowance on this end and through the seam allowance on this end. And that just nicely flattens off the top of the letter O. Chop that off. So there's the top, and then we're going to just do the same again for the bottom. Fold back on line for 17. Careful with those stitches. Try and tear the paper, not your stitches. Trim off. One last time, find yourself a nice straight edge. Pop it on. One last time, check that your raw edges, your straight edges are matching, and then we're going to sew from one end to the other through the seam allowances at either end. And press that one last time. Allow it to cool. Probably more than that, but time is of the essence. Right, so I have now pieced all of that. All 17 pieces have been added, and I have trimmed off the excess. What I like to do now is trim up the block so that it's ready to be sewn into another project or onto another letter to create a word. Or you might want to be adding it to the spools of thread pattern that this has been designed to sit into the middle of. What I'll do now is I will take my acrylic ruler, and I have a 1/4 inch line. I'm going to place that 1/4 inch line on the outside solid edge of my pattern piece. That should mean that the outside edge of my acrylic ruler should sit on the dotted line on the pattern piece. And then I'm going to trim. Now be careful with this because there's lots and lots of seam allowances on the underside, and you'll see that your ruler does not sit flat. So be really careful when you're placing your hand to make sure that you've got your weight nice and evenly distributed on top of your pattern piece, so that when you come to use your rotary cutter that you're not accidentally moving this, because it doesn't sit as firmly, even if it's a Creative Grids, because there's so many seams underneath here, it just won't sit flat. So just bear that in mind and be extra careful. I've got an old rotary blade in here that's still sharp enough, cuts through the paper and will cut through my fabrics as well. So just checking that that's cut through. 1/4 inch line against the outside solid line of my paper pattern. And I'm trimming off. Just doing each side in turn. There we go, all trimmed up and ready to go. So there you go, there's the letter O. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. What do you think? Was it a 2-star or a 3-star? I'm kind of thinking more towards the 2-star because you have only got the one section. Anyway, like I say, I hope you found it really useful. Do check out on YouTube all of the other demonstrations that I have for the other letters in the series. And if you're making them, post on social media, use the hashtag Mini FPP and share your makes. It'd be great to hear from you. Follow along on YouTube, have a look on Instagram, see what I'm up to, and it'll be great to hear from you. I will see you next time.